Hello, I will talk about the 2023 Israeli judicial reform. The 2023 Israeli judicial reform is a proposed series of changes to the judicial system and the balance of powers in Israel put forward by the current Israeli government and spearheaded by the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Justice Yariv Levin and the Chair of Knesset Constitution, Law and Justice Committee Simcha Rotman. It seeks to curb the judiciary's influence over lawmaking and public policy by limiting the Supreme Court's power to exercise the judicial review, granting the government control over judicial appointments and limiting the authority of its legal advisors. If adopted, the reform would grant the Knesset the power to override Supreme Court rulings that deem legislation passed by the Knesset as unconstitutional by reintroducing the legislation and approving it with a majority of Knesset members. The reform would additionally eliminate the ability of courts to conduct a judicial review of basic laws and change the makeup of a judicial selection committee so that a majority of its members are appointed by the government and effective control over the appointment of judges is given to the government. Levin and the ruling government coalition have stated that the above is the first step in their judicial reform and that additional steps are planned, including changing the appointment process of legal advisors to government ministries such that they are appointed and dismissed by the ministers, making their legal advice a recommendation rather than binding on the ministers, and making them subordinate directly to the ministers rather than to the Justice Ministry's professional oversight. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was forbidden from taking part in the debate over his government's judicial reform by Attorney General's order due to a conflict of interests stemming from his ongoing trial. Netanyahu maintains that it is necessary to strike a balance between democratically elected legislators and an activist judiciary that selects its own members and wields undue influence over public policy. The proposed reform has sparked significant backlash both inside and outside of Israel. Opposition leaders and activists accused the government of undermining established norms of checks and balances and attempting to seize absolute power, with some arguing the reform amounts to an attempt at regime change. the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, has called for the reforms to be altered to allow for a wider consultative process, and the President of the Supreme Court of Israel and the Israeli Attorney General have attested to the reforms' illegalities. Protests against the reform erupted in Israel shortly after its introduction, as did significant concern among some in the international community. On 12th of February 2023, Herzog called on the government to cease pushing forward the legislation and to engage in dialogue and coordinated reform with the opposition in an attempt to achieve consensus. The government rejected this proposal, and bills advancing the reforms were passed for a first reading. The next day, on 13th of February 2023. Simultaneously with the reforms curbing the powers of the civil judiciary, the government is progressing reforms to widen the authority of the rabbinical court, allowing them to act as arbitrators in civil matters using religious law if both parties consent. Now I will talk about the main points of the program. After being sworn in as Minister of Justice in the 37th government of Israel, Levin presented his plan for changes to the judicial system. The reform consists of 4 parts. The first reform is disqualification of laws, and it has 4 sections. The first section is an override clause will be enacted. The Knesset will be able, with a majority of 61 of its members, to reenact a law that was enacted and invalidated by the Supreme Court. The law will be valid for 4 years or until 1 year after the start of the next Knesset term, whichever is later. The Knesset will be able to reenact a law that was enacted in a previous Knesset, even if it was unanimously invalidated by the Supreme Court. The second section of the first reform is the court will not be able to discuss fundamental laws. The third section of the first reform is disqualification of laws will be possible only in the Supreme Court with a full composition of 15 judges and with a majority of 80%. The fourth section of the first reform is limiting the duration of the discussion on the disqualification of the law. Okay, so we finished with the first reform. The second reform is the appointment of judges and it has 6 sections. The first section is expansion of the committee for the selection of judges from 9 members to 11, including 7 appointed by the coalition, 1 from the opposition, and 3 judges. Two of the judges will be appointed by the President of the Supreme Court, subject to the right of veto of the Minister of Justice. The second section of the second reform is the cancellation of the secret elections in the Knesset for the selecting of its committee members. Instead, the heads of the Knesset Committee and the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee will be appointed as representatives of the coalition, and the chairman of the State Audit Committee as the representative of the opposition. The third section of the second reform is changing the majority required for the appointment of Supreme Court judges to a simple majority, instead of 7 of 9 members of the committee. For electing judges of the other courts except the Supreme Court, a simple majority was required even before the reform. The fourth section of the second reform is conducting a public hearing in the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee for the candidates for office in the Supreme Court. The fifth section of the second reform is abolition of the seniority system. The President of the Supreme Court will not be the oldest judge in the Supreme Court, but will be chosen by the Committee for the Selection of Judges, and may even be a person who has never served as a judge in the Supreme Court. The sixth section, and the last in the second reform, is allocation of the term of office of the President of the Supreme Court and his deputy for 6 to 7 years, at the end of which they will return to serve as full judges of the Supreme Court. So we finished to talk about the second reform. The third reform is cancellation of the reasonable cause. Cancellation of use of the reason of reasonableness for disqualification of instructions received in accordance with the law and the rules of the administrator. The fourth reform is about legal advisors. The appointment of the Attorney General and the advisors in the ministries by the government and ministries or ministers, defining their opinion as not binding on the government and giving the government the option of independent legal representation in court. So, actually, we finished to talk about the 4 reforms. Now I will talk about the legislative process. I will start with the appointment of judges, the second reform. This is the second reform. On February 13th, 2023, two bills were placed on the Knesset table for first reading on behalf of the Justice Committee. Basic Bill, the Judiciary, Amendment number 3, strengthening the separation of authorities, and Courts Bill, Amendment number 105, and the second bill is instructions regarding the Committee for the Selection of Judges 2023. The first basic bill, the judiciary, includes a change in the composition of the Committee for the Selection of Judges to the following composition. The committee will consist of 9 members who are A. the President of the Supreme Court, as well as 2 retired judges appointed by the Minister of Justice with the approval of the President of the Supreme Court. B. The Minister of Justice will be the chairman of the committee, and 2 other ministers determined by the government. C. The members of the Knesset who are the chairman of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, and 2 other members of the Knesset, 1 from their coalition factions and 1 from the opposition factions. It is further proposed that this committee may act with a missing composition of 5 of its members instead of 7 in the existing law, and that its decisions shall be made by a majority vote of the participants in the vote, unless otherwise stated in the basic law. A third element of the proposal is the determination that the court has no authority to discuss the validity of a basic law. The court's bill includes supplementary amendments to those of the basic law. The judiciary specifies how the members of the Committee for the Selection of Judges will be selected, and in addition states that the candidates for judging in the Supreme Court will be presented for public comments and will appear before the Committee on the Constitution, Law and Justice before the Committee for the Selection of Judges will discuss their case. The proposals were approved in the first reading on February 20th, 2023. The second subject is disqualification of laws. That is the first reform. On March 13th, the Knesset approved in its first reading the basic bill, the Judiciary, Amendment number 4, Judicial Review regarding the validity of a law. According to the proposal, disqualification of laws will be possible only in the Supreme Court with a full composition of 15 judges and with a majority of 80%. The disqualification will only be possible if the court has determined that one of the following occurred. A. The law clearly contradicts a provision in the basic law for which the majority required to change it, or the condition for violating it fixed in the basic law. B. The law was not accepted in the Knesset by the majority or the number of readings necessary for its acceptance according to a basic law, a law, or the Knesset's regulations. The Supreme Court will not discuss the disqualification of a law that includes an override clause, meaning it explicitly states that it is valid despite what is stated in the basic law. Okay, thank you very much.